The following podcast is presented by Blue Ridge Production.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Unpacking the Occupation. I am a little sad today because this is our last episode of the series, and I cannot believe I am saying that. When I first started this podcast as part of my capstone project, I hope it would become a place where caregivers could learn a little bit more about occupational therapy and maybe walk away with a few practical ideas that they can use at home. And even though that was my main goal, my main focus, what I didn't expect was just how much of these conversations would impact me and all of the, information that I've learned through interviewing these amazing caregivers. Over the past several weeks, we've talked about everything from big emotions to potty training to sensory, communication, play, feeding, and even caregiver wellness, because caregiving can be really, really hard. But more than anything, we've heard the stories behind those occupations, the real moments that happen in the kitchens, living rooms, playgrounds, bedtime routines, all of it, every single day. And so today's episode is going to be a little different. Instead of tuning in with a caregiver, it is going to be me today solo, kind of reflecting on this entire series and the episodes that we've went ahead and recorded that you guys listened to. I'm also going to be talking about some caregiver feedback that was given to me and just, these incredible parents whose words tell the story much better than I ever could. So whether you've been here since episode 1 or you're just joining us today, thank you for being a part of this journey with me. So let's go ahead and unpack it one last time. When I first started planning this podcast, I thought my role was to educate caregivers, which I did, right? I did my research. I framed every single episode based on the caregiver concern. I spent countless hours researching, finding the best strategies to go ahead and educate these parents on. And I am so lucky I had the opportunity to do so. But somewhere along the way, I realized that the caregivers were educating me. And every family welcomed us into a different part of their lives. Some of them shared joyful moments, funny moments. Some shared really difficult ones. But every single story reminded me that there is no perfect way to parent. That word should not exist, because when I think of perfect, I think of robots, and kids deserve more than robot parents. They deserve parents who make mistakes, who learn from mistakes, who get down on the ground and play with them even after a super long day of work. One thing I noticed across every episode was that parents weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for understanding. Understanding why their child melts down before bedtime, why transitions are hard, why feeding is so stressful, why play is so powerful, and why their child responds differently than other children. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts occupational therapy can offer, not quick fixes, but understanding and, having the families understand the why behind any behavior. And looking back through all of these conversations, there were a few themes that kept coming up over and over again. And one of my favorites was hearing parents realize that play isn't just play. It's how they learn, communicate, build confidence, develop relationships. And I loved hearing caregivers begin looking at everyday play through a completely different lens. Another lesson that really stood out was learning to meet children where they are instead of expecting them to respond like little adults. Like I said, children don't deserve robot parents, and parents don't deserve robot children. Mistakes happen. We learn from them. We let them develop and discover how they can get better from these mistakes, not only as a child, but as a parent as well. And throughout the series, we also talked about executive functioning, sensory processing, emotional regulation for both parents and their children, and just child development in general. But what all of those topics really had in common was children are still learning. They're still learning how to communicate, to regulate, participate in really hard occupations that fill their day. And sometimes our role isn't to rush that process, it's simply to support it. There was um a moment, a personal moment that I had with my son where I'm not too sure how old he was, but he was beginning to become independent, wanted to do things on his own. For example, getting in and out of his car seat. And while he had the fine motor skills to unclip himself and the top buckle, there's a bottom buckle that was a little bit more difficult because you needed a lot more finger strength to press down that button to unfasten the seatbelt. And he was trying so hard to get out of there. And initially, I was in a rush because I wanted to get out. It was super hot that day and I just wanted to get inside. But he kept saying, "No, mommy, I can do it. I can do it." And in the back of my head, I'm getting frustrated. But then a moment of realization was, okay, no, let me slow down. Let me help him through it, talk him through it, because this is him showing me, telling me that he wants to be independent, that he wants to learn these skills to unfasten this most difficult car seat ever. And it goes back to what I had said, that our role as parents, we don't rush the process. We are there to support it, to help them through it, to give that just right challenge that I've talked about throughout this entire series. So that way they can develop these skills on their own, with, of course, our support as parents as well. So while I had so much fun recording these different episodes with my caregivers and learning so much from them, one of my favorite things was ultimately reading the feedback that the caregivers left afterwards. So, what I've learned throughout OT school and throughout my fieldwork experience is that as occupational therapists, we always hope the education we provide makes a difference. But seeing parents describe how they applied these ideas in everyday lives reminds me why caregiver education is so important. And what I found especially meaningful was that every caregiver walked away with something different. There wasn't one strategy that worked for every family because every child is different. Instead, each caregiver found something that fit their child, their routines, and their family's unique needs. And that was my main goal. One of my main goals for this podcast series was having families walk away with a OT strategy that they can put in their toolkit, right? That they can use later on in the household to help support them and their child's needs. And I would love to share some of those responses with you because they beautifully captured what this project was all about. So, one response was echoing method to help with speech delay. One caregiver shared that the echoing method was the most valuable strategy they learned throughout the series. And I loved reading this because it was such a simple strategy that can make a huge difference. And basically, the echoing method encouraged parents to repeat and slightly expand on what their child is saying. So rather than correcting them, you're modeling the language in a natural and supportive way. So, for example, if your child says car, you might respond, "Yeah, that's a big blue car." This supports language development while keeping the interaction fun and pressure free. As occupational therapists, we also know that communication happens during everyday occupations like playing, eating, meals together, reading books, or getting ready for bed. Parents don't need to create a special therapy sessions at home. Those everyday conversations become an opportunity for learning. And they also just happen naturally when you're having discussions with your spouse, with your child, with yourself, right? Thinking out loud, your child is able to pick that up and just help them develop on that receptive language skill. Another response was just simple, that they learned about play. And sometimes the simplest answers say the most. And honestly, that throughout this podcast, we talked about how play is a child's primary occupation. It's not just an entertainment, it's how children develop problem solving skills, learn to communicate, all the things. And one of my biggest hopes for this podcast was helping caregivers realize when they get down on the floor and they play with their child, they're already doing something incredibly meaningful. The next response that was left was lavender scents and hard hugs. So this one, it immediately made me think about sensory processing because I remember this episode. And this caregiver, using calming scents alongside firm, comforting hugs became part of their child's bedtime routine to help the child get to sleep or prepare to go to sleep and stay asleep. And those hard hugs provide the proprioceptive input that I've been discussing and sharing throughout this entire series, which is that sensory information that our muscles and joints receive through deep pressure. Now, many children find deep pressure calming because it helps their nervous system organize sensory information and prepares their body for rest. So, preparing the calming scent like lavender and those tight hugs help support relaxation and sleep. And it also reminds us that sensory strategies aren't about eliminating behaviors, they're about helping children find their own just right state. And also, a very inexpensive way to incorporate sensory strategies at home, deep pressure hugs, massages, lighting a candle, dimming the lights, setting the environment, just to allow your child's body prepare for that nighttime routine when going to sleep. The next response is understanding that my child is still developing mentally and helping them better understand the tasks I am asking them to do. And this one captures one of the biggest mindset shifts from the entire series. Because sometimes when children struggle with transitions, following directions, or emotional regulation, it can be easy to assume that they're choosing not to listen. But oftentimes, their brains are still developing these skills needed to do what we're asking them to do. And when caregivers begin looking at behavior through a developmental lens instead of assuming defiance, everything changes. That understanding naturally supports co regulation, which has been the biggest theme throughout my entire podcast series. So instead of asking, why are they doing this? We begin asking, how can I help them through this moment? And that's often where the connection begins. And just to remind our listeners, right, if you're tuning in for the first time right now, I talk heavily about co-regulation as our children borrowing our calm. Because if we aren't able to regulate ourselves first, we are definitely not going to be able to regulate our child at the end. And so developing that skill, it's difficult, but it is possible, right? And it's as simple as taking deep breaths with yourself or with your child, right? Teaching them how to breathe in 4 seconds, hold 4 seconds, and let it out for 4 seconds. And it's as simple as doing a breathing technique for you and them. The next response is giving my child a pep talk before heading to the park to help reduce tantrums because they knew what to expect. Now, this one, it just highlights how powerful giving that narrative, that preparation is for your child when it comes to transitioning. Because children often do better when they know what's coming next. And it's something as simple as saying, we're going to the park and then it's time to leave. We'll go down the slide one last time before heading home, right? Something like that. And this just helps children mentally prepare for that transition. Those pep talks support executive functioning skills by reducing uncertainty and giving children a predictable plan, right? They're also a wonderful example of how small change in communication can make everyday routines feel smoother for the whole family. I did share this strategy that I did use throughout my fieldwork rotation. I even use it at home with my own son, and it's the PREMAC principle. Basically, it's the first then language. So, for example, you could say, first we'll wash our hands, then we go back to play. Again, this helps the child predict what's coming next and help smoothen that transition to another activity. And one of the last response is playing the kind of games my child plays with their friends. Because sometimes the most meaningful intervention or activity is simply joining your child's world and, incorporating what they're interested in your daily activity, your daily schedule. And when caregivers participate in activities that their children absolutely love and they already enjoy, they're actually building connections, they're strengthening relationships, they're creating opportunities for communication, problem solving, turn taking, attention, all the things. And those moments may seem small, but they are often the ones that children remember the most. And it could be as simple as playing toy dinosaurs, playing video games, right? Sitting down, coloring with them, or going outside picking flowers. And those are the most impactful moments that you and your child could have. And one of the earlier episodes, I did talk about how it was quality time over the quantity of time. And even if you can give, yourself maybe 20 minutes, dedicate 20 minutes to put down your phone, stop what you're doing and just take the time to be with your child. That is more impactful than spending the entire day with them, right? Just creating these small, meaningful moments. And reading all of these responses reminded me that this project was never about creating perfect parents. It was about helping caregivers feel a little more confident, a little more supportive, and maybe a little less alone. Occupational therapy isn't about having every single answer. It's about giving families practical tools that fit naturally into their everyday lives. And if there's one thing that these caregivers have taught me, it's that sometimes even one small strategy can completely change the way a family experiences an occupation. So, as I wrap up this podcast and my doctoral capstone, I do find myself thinking less about what I taught and more about what I will carry with me as a future occupational therapist. Um, and that is to be open minded, to actively listen to what parents are, their concerns about their child are. And it just also reminded me that every child has a unique story, every family has a unique story, and they have their own journey. And every occupation, whether it's getting dressed, brushing teeth, eating dinner, or playing Pokemon together, it's an opportunity to build connections. Those everyday moments that may seem small, but those are the moments that matter the most. So, for those who have been following along since episode 1, I love to leave my listeners an OT tip of the day towards the end of my episode. And for our very last OT tip of the day, I do want to leave you with something that I hope you'll carry with you long after this podcast ends. No crying, okay? Nobody cry. And that tip is you don't have to be perfect to be exactly what your child needs. As parents, it's so easy to feel like we need to have all the answers. And we wonder if we're doing enough, if we're saying the right thing, or if we're making the right decisions, right? But throughout this entire series, one thing became so clear to me, and that's your child doesn't need a perfect parent. They need a parent who keeps showing up, who is willing to learn, who's willing to celebrate the little victories, who's willing to get on the floor and play with them even after a long day. I know I said that again, but that is so important, right? And just a parent who offers love, patience, and connection, even on the toughest days. Occupational therapy has taught me that meaningful progress rarely happens overnight. It happens through small moments that build over time. A deep breath before brushing teeth, a few extra minutes of play, a hug after a hard day, trying new food, playing with your child, laughing together over a favorite video game, right? Those moments matter more than you know. So, as you leave this series, I do hope that you give yourself the same grace that you've so freely given your child. Celebrate the progress, embrace those imperfections, and remember, you don't have to be perfect to be exactly what your child needs. Before I say a very heartfelt goodbye, I do want to say a big mahalo, a big thank you to every caregiver who has trusted me with their family story, to everyone who's listened, supported this podcast, and followed along throughout this entire journey. And thank you to my capstone mentors, faculty, family, and friends who have encouraged me every step of the way. Also, a big thank you to my husband and my son who have made this podcast series more meaningful to me. And I know this podcast may be coming to an end, but I truly hope that the conversation continues. Keep asking those questions, keep celebrating the little victories, and keep finding joy in the everyday occupations that make life meaningful. And most importantly, keep unpacking the occupation. Again, follow me on Instagram, OT to see any podcast updates, how my OT journey is going so far, see any updates of me graduating, all the things of my OT journey on my Instagram, OT Again, this has been Unpacking the Occupation. Mahalo to everyone who has given me all of the support and love.